For over 4 generations, Palestinians and Israelis have contested over the lands west of the Jordan River. For nearly as long, U.S. administrations have sought to cajole or pressure a consensual settlement of this issue. In late January, President Trump unveiled his vision for this elusive peace. President Trump's long-anticipated entry met with praise in many quarters and long-anticipated rejections elsewhere, including by leading Palestinian authorities and sympathizers. It is doubtful that the tenor of these early reactions surprised either the president or his team. As the late, great Middle Eastern scholar Fuad Ajami often reminded us, men love the troubles they know. It is worth deeper reflection on whether this new plan might have the better consequences for which the president hopes. The president asserts that changed realities in this conflict, this region, and the world merit a new approach. He claims not an immediate solution, but a realistic framework for future negotiations. Near the core of today's discussions lie the intersection of longstanding U.S. concerns, including, high among them, Americans' belief in peaceful compromise and Americans' desire to see all peoples everywhere live in dignity and security, with a say in their future and a chance for a decent life. What lies behind the president's vision? Where may it lead the parties and the U.S.? And how do these possible outcomes compare to what might have happened had he pursued other courses? On behalf of the Hudson Institute, I welcome you all to today's discussion of these and other aspects of President Trump's vision for peace. My name is Scooter Libby, and we are lucky to be able to feature today 2 of our colleagues here at Hudson. Those of you familiar with Hudson's Middle East work will know well the work of Michael Doran. A longtime professor, formerly with the Bush administration's National Security Council, Michael is the author of numerous important works, some not without being some controversy surrounding them. These include oft-cited articles on U.S. policy regarding Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Syria, and Israel, as well as his widely lauded book on the 1954 Suez Crisis and the origins of modern U.S. Middle East policy. To our great pleasure, our second panelist, John Lerner, joined Hudson not so long ago. In prior years, John served as a legislative assistant to congressmen on the Senate and House Foreign Affairs committees. More recently, he served as deputy to Nikki Haley, American ambassador to the UN. As such, John also served on the Deputies Committee of the National Security Council, where he had a hand in developing the Trump plan. 8 months ago, John wrote of, quote, critics who cling to Middle East constructs that have proven unimplementable, close quote. Today, we'll see whether critics cling to John. Please join me in welcoming them both to the stage and for their discussion.
So thank you. We were expecting Victoria Coates from the White House to be here, but she has inexplicably been detained. We can only assume at this point that she's not showing up. So I feel a little bit like Clint Eastwood talking to the empty chair. But maybe it won't be empty in the end. But so it's going to be a conversation with John and me. John, you actually played a role in formulating this plan. So maybe you could get us started by just describing how it differs from previous plans and what was the thinking that went into it.
Sure. Well, let me start by saying I was admittedly sort of a backbencher in the creation of the plan. I was not at all the tip of the spear.
This is not what you do in Washington.
Yes, I credit my former colleagues in the administration, Jason Greenblatt and Jared Kushner and David Friedman, as the principal architects of the plan. It differs in a number of significant ways. Certainly it differs in its depth and length and its desire to address a much broader array of topics than previous plans. Previous plans, more or less, were about a page long, covered broad topics, and then left what was called final status issues to a later time. This plan is dramatically different. It's over 100 pages long, addresses all, quote, final status topics, and goes into great detail about what economic development, for example, for a Palestinian state would look like or could look like. So that's a huge difference, but I'd say from a more sort of philosophical underpinning, the difference between this plan and previous ones is that it's very much about realism, that previous plans attempted to change realities on the ground. This plan, I think, accepts realities on the ground and offers the Palestinians a opportunity to have a state while recognizing those realities. And I'll just point to a couple of them. So the notion that Jerusalem was going to be a divided city with East Jerusalem as the capital of the Palestinian state is sort of taken as a given in over decades of consideration of this plan, and certainly a given at the United Nations and in other international forums. But it's completely unrealistic. There is no negotiated scenario under which the Israelis would accept a divided Jerusalem. This plan acknowledges that reality. A couple of others, what the Palestinians call the right of return, or millions of Palestinian refugees returning to what is today Israel. That was always delayed in previous plans as a final status issue, but everyone recognizes, even the Arab world, the Palestinians themselves, that that's never going to happen. And so, the administration's approach toward UNRWA and toward the right of return is embodied in this plan. And then thirdly, and perhaps most controversially, the issue of settlements, that the reality is that given where the Israeli political spectrum has gravitated to, there's no scenario under which any Israeli government is going to uproot hundreds of thousands of Israeli citizens from their homes in the West Bank. And this plan recognizes that. Now, of course, all of those things are very big setbacks to sort of the Palestinian grand vision of what a solution could be. And yet, despite those disappointments for the Palestinians, the plan in great detail outlines an independent Palestinian state with a recognized capital to the east of Jerusalem, with over 80% of the land that they currently claim as part of their state, with a massive amount of international economic support, with commercial tunnels from the West Bank to Gaza, with access to Israeli ports. And so the fundamental thought behind the plan was, instead of putting out a broad vision and letting the parties do what they can to get it, let's put out a plan that actually addresses all of these topics, what we think would be a equitable final outcome that both sides could be pleased with, reasonably pleased with, and see where it goes from there. So anyway, that's the thinking behind it.
Let me just turn to Victoria and see if she has anything to comment. No, Victoria has nothing to go. Victoria has a secret she's keeping from all of us.
Having nothing to do.
Very tough crowd here. Very tough crowd here. From my own point of view, I see this. Well, what we're hearing from a lot of the critics is they're saying this will never work, I both completely agree with them and think that it's a nonsensical statement because it's presented, the it will never work notion is presented as if there is some path out there that will work. And that they know exactly what it is. My own view, and it has been my view for a very long time, is that there actually is no path that is going to bring peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. That the two sides are so far apart that all of the best minds working on this cannot bridge those gaps. I mean, if you just any, you pick any major issue, settlements, Jerusalem, right of return, borders, and so on. The two sides are actually very far apart. But there has been this myth in Washington since the days of Oslo, really. I mean, since 1995, for sure, that we're really this close. I mean, when I worked in the White House in the Bush administration, had responsibility for this issue, the claim was, well, I argued against, when I was in there 2005 to 2007, I argued against a major initiative because I outlined in memo after memo to the president all of the distance between the two sides, the political weakness at the time, it was Olmert and Abbas, the political weakness of the two, how they're not going to be able to deliver, and it would be a waste of American time, effort, and investment to even try to move this forward. Nonetheless, people more influential than myself pushed it forward. We had the Annapolis conference. Nothing came of it. And I met one of the people at the State Department who was a top guy who planned the Annapolis conference. And after the failure, I said to him, so, haha, I was right and you guys were wrong. And he got quite angry with me for obvious reasons. But he said, we were this close. We were this close. We solved 95% of the issues. It was just that last little 5% that got in the way. But that's always going to be the way. I mean, the United States is a superpower. The Palestinians and the Israelis are not. The game between the two of them is the blame game to see who's going to get blamed for the failure. So they come as far toward the United States concepts, whatever concepts the U.S. puts out, they come as far toward it as they can to keep the game going. But in the end, they know that there's not going to actually be an agreement, and that if you're sitting in that room where diplomats are coming up with concepts that allow them to entertain your concepts but not actually make the decision and so on, it can feel like you're just like you're this close, but you're actually miles away, and you're better off if you just read the newspapers of the two sides and see where they are. So I find this to be just, if nothing else, purely from a Washington point of view, just a breath of fresh air, because it forces the peace processors who are saying we're just, we're this close. It forces them to justify that feeling, because there are very few issues in international politics where we have so much experience to base an opinion on. I doubt there's another issue in American diplomacy that has been pursued so doggedly at such high levels over multiple administrations as the Palestinian Israeli peace. And yet, poof, there's nothing there.
Yeah, I agree with that. And you described it as sort of the game that's being played. I would say that the terms of the game have changed a bit. It used to be the case, and in fact, they may still think it's the case, that I think the Palestinian view was that time was on their side, that the Palestinians had more friends than the Israelis in the international community. They certainly dominated, still do to a significant degree, dominate sort of the UN approach to this topic. They had more or less united support from the Arab states. They would at times use violence as a way to pressure the Israelis into concessions. Most of those factors have been diminished because of changes in the region, and I think time is very much not on the Palestinian side here. The international reaction to the plan was not nearly as strongly rejectionist as the Palestinian response was. So you have some daylight between the Europeans and the Arabs from the Palestinian position. Most of the Arab states have far more pressing concerns in the region than the Palestinian issue. The capacity for violence as a way to try to pressure the system has been reduced by Israeli actions. And many of the steps that the Trump administration has taken have strengthened the Israeli position such that, again, I'm not saying they see it this way, but I think an objective observer might conclude that that time is not on the Palestinian side, that the gap between Israeli strength, not just strength on the ground, but also strength internationally, and the poor condition of the lives of the Palestinians, certainly in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, is growing wider, and that it's not really the Israelis who need to have this agreement. The Israelis would like to have an agreement, but they can continue on the path that they're on and be a very successful country. The Palestinians stand to gain a whole lot more. But I agree that that's part of the 5% that hasn't been, the part of the nut that hasn't been cracked yet. But I do think that as time evolves, there could become a change in the thinking of the Palestinian leadership on this question. Certainly no time soon, possibly
But so you'd agree with me, though, that the chance that this is actually going to result in the deal of the century is pretty small.
Certainly in the near term, there's no expectation that that there will be a signing ceremony at the White House anytime soon. But that's never really been the lens through which success was intended to be judged in this case. The success has to be judged over a period of time. In fact, in the plan itself, it outlines a four-year period in which the Palestinians have the option to take steps toward what would be necessary in order for them to gain the recognition and the benefits that are included in the plan. But yes, I agree that there's no expectation of the deal of the century being achieved this year.
So what we're really talking about then, if we cut through all the rhetoric, is this is a bilateral U.S.-Israeli plan for moving forward on the assumption that there is not going to be a Palestinian partner. Of course, there's always a seat there that can be filled if they're interested in accepting the terms in the bilateral Israeli discussion. Yeah. But absent that, the things are going to go forward, and the United States is not going to continue holding the ring, waiting for the Palestinians to show up.
Correct. Things are definitely going to go forward. There's this question about Israeli moves toward annexation, and that might or might not happen in the near term. But even if it does not happen in the near term, there will be a move in that direction, such that the realities on the ground will, if the Palestinians decline to participate, the realities on the ground will continue to work to their detriment. I wrote a piece about this in, I think it was in September, after the second Israeli election of last year, in which I wrote about how all of the incentives push in the direction of in favor of Palestinian engagement on this. If they were, and I don't expect it, I certainly don't predict it, if they were to signal that they're willing to not accept everything in this plan, but take it basically, as the Arab states have largely said, as a basis upon which to negotiate, they would receive a very receptive audience in doing so, and they likely would forestall any Israeli moves toward annexation. It appears as though they're unlikely to do that, in which case the Israelis likely would move forward with U.S. blessing, as it is blessed in the plan itself, and the Palestinian position would continue to weaken. In some senses, what the plan does, and the broader policies that encases it, is that it places the burden of action on the Palestinians, that if they want to be serious about having an independent state, it's in their interest to move quickly on that.
Let me ask you a question here. So those incentives were there, or disincentives, however you want to describe it, the pressure on the Palestinians, that was there pretty much in the nature of the situation. What I'm trying to say is, if I'm correct that this is not going to actually result in an Israeli-Palestinian deal, then it invites the question, why bother with the plan at all? Mm-hmm. I mean, wouldn't it, suppose I were to say to you, look, what the United States should do is do no harm, right? The status quo is, the status quo is holding. Why go in and stick this hornet's nest why poke it with a stick?
Well, I mean, it is not intended to do that. There was a genuine, and I can say this with full knowledge of what was going on in 2017 in the Trump administration at the time. There was every intention of having the Palestinians be a part of the genesis of the plan. That their input was sought rather repeatedly. When the administration decided in late 2017 to move the embassy and recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, in accordance with the United States law of longstanding, the Palestinian leadership had a choice to make, and they made the wrong choice. They chose at that point to cut off all dialogue with the Trump administration and basically, go their own way. Instead, had they made the choice roughly as follows and said, look, we don't like this move by the United States, we don't agree with it, we don't accept it, but we take the president at his word that he's willing to engage with us and to bring us in and have a discussion about, the deal of the century. And we will work with him to see whether we can, come up with a plan that is closer to what we want. They would have had a completely receptive audience. And that audience remains the case today. So when you ask the question, well, why go ahead and poke at this? It's really not intended to poke in the sense of, creating mischief and ill will, but it is intended to poke in the sense of moving a process along. Right. So in the past, there was no penalty particularly for Palestinian rejection of plans. So
No, I mean, pardon me for interrupting, but as you point out, there was a kind of perverse incentive, because what they were offered by Barak, right, was not as good as what they were offered by Olmert.
Right.
And they did have an expectation that the international community would do their work for them. The international community, being the United States and Europe, right, would press Israel to make more concessions without them having to actually engage the process.
Entirely correct. And the change now is to say, well, the United States anyway, certainly not the rest of the world, but the United States has recognized Jerusalem as the capital. Separately, we've done what we've done on the Golan Heights, and now we're more or less accepting the notion of Israeli sovereignty over the Jordan Valley and the settlement blocks. The longer the Palestinians wait, the more they will continue to lose ground, whereas previously there was no such penalty to obstinacy.
Unfortunately, I don't believe that kind of pressure is going to work in terms of, as I say, in terms of bringing them to the table. But that, I believe, has always been the reality. I think U.S. policy is best when it actually deals with reality. And we were the Clinton parameters of December 2000, which are the kind of remain the bedrock of the two-state solution as understood in Washington think tanks and so on. I always thought that they were wildly out of line with reality. There was this fiction that we'd pretend that the Palestinians were going to come along and say, we have no problem with the Israelis controlling the Jordan Valley. But they were never going to accept that. Now, there is one aspect of the plan that I think that I looked at and I thought it was it's an acknowledgement of reality in a way, but I thought it was wrong-headed. I'd like to get your thoughts on that. And that's the fact that no settler communities will be uprooted. So in what is basically the Palestinian state or the Palestinian entity, however you want to call it, we still have all of these settler communities. That looks to me to be, from a practical point of view, wholly unworkable.
Yeah. So a couple of points about that. As you well know, the vast majority of Israelis who live in the West Bank live in cities and large towns. So the largest big percentage of them are in sort of homogenous communities that are fairly easily absorbed into Israel. There's a small minority that live in what you're describing as sort of outlier settlement posts. And what I'd say about that is that, Jared Kushner has said publicly in his interviews that, there is still some meat on the bones for Palestinians to get if they continue to negotiate, if they actually engage in negotiation, and if instead of calling for days of rage, they actually sat down and negotiated. There may be any number of features of the plan that could be adjusted, and while I'm not in a position to do the bargaining, it would seem as though that element that you're describing could be one that is negotiable. There are others as well. So the plan is not intended to be dictated to the parties. It's still the vision of this would be that the two parties actually negotiate it, and there are any number of features of it that either could be modified or do not answer certain questions that are left to the negotiations. But again, to the previous point, the penalty for non-engagement on the Palestinian side is that everything in the plan, sort of becomes operative, at least on the Israeli side, if there's no back and forth on it.
One of the reasons that I find it to be a breath of fresh air is that it gives people like me an opportunity to ask the question, what is the place of this issue in the larger U.S. strategy toward the Middle East? Now, that isn't addressed in the plan itself, but this issue has such a hold over the moral imagination of Americans, over their religious sensibilities. It's such an issue in domestic American politics and so on, that it kind of takes on a life of its own. I saw this firsthand in the White House. How every senior you have senior American leaders who don't know the difference between a Sunni and a Shiite, but they all have a very strong opinion about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And then there's also this notion that we are there to do good. Right? So the question about a U.S. policy toward the Israeli-Palestinian question is, how can we solve this problem? Not what is the American interest and how does how does that interest connect up to other American interests in the region? And for me, I was a supporter of the Oslo process back when, and I watched over time as my optimism about this possibility has eroded, and I realized looking back that that the 90s were kind of a special moment. The Cold War had ended. The Arab rejectionist camp was completely on its face on the ground. And it seemed like anything was possible, and all kinds of lines that we had come to think of as immovable were moving and changing, and so it seemed like a good idea. Let's go and try it. But the world has changed drastically since then, and we now have the rise of jihadism. We have the disintegration of the Arab states. We have the return of Russia as a spoiler. We have the rise of Iran. To me, the focus of the United States should be on the rise on the rise of Iran. There's no reason to believe that supporting. We learned from the Gaza withdrawal that moving Israel out of Palestinian territory doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that we get a more stability. Actors like Iran are going to move in there immediately. We're going to be weakening an ally at a moment when the United States is very ambivalent about the region and has to be working through allies. So I think shoring up Israel, shoring up the Gulf, taking advantage of the growing cooperation between the Gulf and Israel. This is the thinking that should be dominating in Washington, and I assume that is all part of this vision. Although they're not selling it in that way.
Yeah, well, let me. So I assume from what you said that you would place the Palestinian question at maybe 7th or 8th on the list of priorities. I personally think it's a third-tier strategic issue. It's just above Western Sahara. I think that.
I'm an outlier in this.
Well, you may be increasingly less of an outlier in the sense that if you look at it from the Arab states' viewpoint, most of the Arab states, I think they would privately agree with that assessment, that their interest is in coming to some resolution that is satisfactory to the Palestinian population, so that they can sort of move beyond this issue and focus on the much more on the real threats to themselves. And then, of course, there are the rejectionist states. In this case, it would be Iran and Turkey. they play the Palestinian card as a way to promote themselves as the defenders of the Islam and the Palestinian people, but they have no particular strategic interest in which towns in the West Bank are governed by Palestinians versus governed by Israelis. So I think there is in the region an increasing view that this issue is not one of great importance. And again, to me, that goes back to the notion that that time is not on the side of the Palestinians, because even their most natural friends in this matter are losing patience with them. And you see that even in a place as sort of corrupt as the United Nations, where the Palestinians are having difficulty literally today in getting support on the Security Council for a watered down condemnation of the Trump plan. Yes, I think that the United States interests in the region are much more threatened by any number of other factors than this one.
All right, well, listen, we're at 1 o'clock. We're going to have an abbreviated session today since we were not joined by Victoria, but why don't we open it up to some questions? We have a gentleman over here.
Hi, it's Doğan Işık from Turkish Embassy. I would like to ask, what's the American interest in rushing to recognize the annexation of large parts of Palestinian territories? But what's the American view?
Why do you take that?
I don't think there's been a rush to recognize the annexation, because the administration actually held up the annexation. I think there's a sense that major settlement blocks, the Jordan Valley, these are always going to be, in any American conception, these are going to be part of the under Israeli control or Israeli sovereignty. We are not going to ever have within the likelihood that we're going to get a Palestinian leadership that is going to sit down and actually negotiate an end of conflict and end of claims is extremely small. And so we should start working with our partner, Israel, toward settling the issue between us, so that it is no longer a thorn in our side between the two of us. I think, in my own view, this can't speak for obviously can't speak for the administration. The United States has three major allies in the region, and they are Israel, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. The U.S. should be working to shore up the relations with all three. They don't get along with each other. Part of the job of the United States is to be the buffer between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, and between Turkey and Israel. And we need to do that because the United States is not going to be as deeply involved in the Middle East as it has been in the past. I mean, I think that's quite obvious. Among the fantasies of the peace process was that the United States was going to be the great guarantor of whatever peace agreement was made between the two parties. I don't think anyone in the region can look at a United States guarantee today as valuable as a United States guarantee in, say, 1995, because everyone is uncertain about where the United States is where the United States is going. Everyone, including the Turks. This is reality. This is reality, and it's reality that American policy needs to take into account. And so we still have interests in the region. We're not going to be dictating everything that goes on the ground. So we need to work closely with our partners. It's that vision, I think, that animates this plan.
Sarah Stern, Ian Damman from Middle East Truth. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentations. Two brief questions, a few words, if you will, about Mahmoud Abbas and Ahmed Olmart's publicity tour in New York today, number one. And number two, listening to the Democratic candidates, the major candidates, who feel that the Trump administration has tipped the scales towards Israel. If I were a Palestinian, I would kind of wait it out and hope there's a Democratic president. Do you think, borrowing from Santayana's adage, that a Democrat is perfectly capable, once he's in the White House, of not learning the lessons of history and going back?
With regard to Olmert, I find his move there with Abbas to be very much akin to the U.S. critics from previous administrations whose case seems to be, if only you would follow the failed paths of the approaches of the past, everything would be okay and promising. I just don't understand the logic there. People of goodwill in any number of American administrations have attempted to deal with this, and also previous Israeli leaders, all with more or less a similar formula, two-state solution, 67 borders, play around with the edges of Jerusalem, etc. And there was no success, not even close to any success. And in fact, many would say from the Israeli standpoint that that process led them to setbacks and to damaging their own security situation, certainly with regard to the withdrawal from Gaza. And I think Olmert is just unable to let go of this sort of fantasy that we came so close, as Michael said before, we came so close, let's just keep, pushing it over the line. I think that it really is mythology. With regard to the Democrats running for president, here's what I think about that. I think that irrespective of who wins our election in November, the content of this plan, having the plan being put out as it has been, does change the political dynamics surrounding these issues in both the Israeli political context and the US one, such that I think that with this plan, even if it doesn't sort of get off the ground, so to speak, with this plan on the table, it becomes very hard for future Israeli governments, regardless of which party, what the coalition makeup is in Israel, it becomes more difficult for Israeli governments to accept a plan that is dramatically less generous to them than this plan. And I think from the US standpoint, notwithstanding the statements of the many Democrats who are running for president, I think given the nature of Congress and the nature of the political forces within our country, it becomes much more difficult for a future US administration of either party to propose a plan that is much more like what came before and unlike this plan. So I think that regardless of election outcomes in either country, this plan is going to serve a purpose going forward of shifting the markers.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I don't believe that the Olmert offer, for example, which the administration that I worked for elicited, could ever have been past the Knesset. And I don't think, back to the previous question about the American interest, it's not in the American interest to cram down the throat of allies plans that have no chance of being of succeeding. I mean, we're just handing to the enemies of our allies, who are our enemies, a club to beat up our allies, and we're not dealing with reality. And who actually believes that? Let's just fantasize for a moment and say the United States forced the Israelis totally out of the West Bank. Totally, it's never going to happen. But let's say we used all of our national power to force them out of the West Bank, and handed control to Mahmoud Abbas. How many people believe that that's going to make this a more stable area? It's going to make. How many people actually believe that's good for Jordan? To have. How many people believe that Mahmoud Abbas, without any kind of Israeli security infrastructure behind him, can forestall the takeover of Hamas, the entry of Iran there, and so forth? I mean, these are the kinds of questions that should be at the forefront of our mind when we make any plan. And I think those previous plans were not starting from that sort of security point of view. One of the nice things about the plan is it starts with the primacy of security. That's American security, not just Israeli security. Another question? Sir, in the back.
Thank you. I wanted to thank Mr. Lerner for an exceptionally clear and helpful account of what's actually in the agreement and how it was conceived. My question
Thanks for Victoria.
seeks a little bit more clarification. It starts from an observation that many people have made over the years, but especially in this context, that one of the difficulties of all the previous ways of approaching the issue allowed Palestinians to indulge an ultimate hope of getting rid of Israel altogether, and that was connected with leaving as final status issues Jerusalem, right of return, and so forth. It's been further observed that in that context, what this agreement seems to have done is to say, no, forget about that as in any way an operative premise for negotiations. And in that regard, it will be extremely helpful. But I was wondering, in the process of formulating this plan, whether the administration, yourself and your colleagues, were very conscious of that as an objective.
Yes, in fact, we were. There was and this goes to many other features aside from just the plan. The administration's outlook upon taking office with regard to Israeli issues, including the Israeli-Palestinian issue, was to overcome a number of myths that have existed in this issue set for a long time, and to treat things in more real terms. Furthermore, there was a conscious choice to avoid what I think many previous administrations of both parties had sought, which was a perception of even-handedness. There was a conscious choice that, as between a very strong and important ally and a people that we have sympathies for and humanitarian impulses toward, but who have, certainly not been an ally and often have been hostile to U.S. interests, there was no need for us to be even-handed anymore. We would like to develop a plan and an approach that fostered, peace and stability in the region, but there was a recognition that in many ways the very attempt at the perception of even-handedness was actually counterproductive, and the genesis of this, at least in the immediate period between the Trump election and the inauguration, was the passage of UN Security Council Resolution 2334 in the waning days of the outgoing Obama administration, where they declined to veto at the UN what was essentially a Palestinian wish list, a a UN embrace of more or less the totality of Palestinian aims. And the view of the new administration coming in, and I was involved with it at that time, was that that's not a starting position that we accept. Our position is going to be based on realism and favoring our ally, that there was nothing wrong with showing favoritism toward, in a two-party situation, showing favoritism toward the party that was more valuable to American interests and values. And so we did that. Now, hopefully, that doesn't, if the Palestinian reaction to that has been, well, if that's your approach, then, we want nothing to do with you. That's not been the response of most of the Arab community, which I would say, I think, maybe Michael would differ on this, but I think it's correct that the Arab community sees the Trump administration in much more positive terms than they saw the Obama administration.
There was the gentleman here with the glasses, yeah.
Henry Hecker, retired government. Back in January 1919, the League of Nations was a great proposal as part of the peace treaty, and there was a great deal of furor in the Senate and Congress, and finally they were able to obtain the votes of some Republicans who defected from their party to support the plan if they dropped Article 10 of the treaty. So they were able to come up with a plan to alter the treaty and get it to fly. And the question would be the current treaty or the current peace plan that they've developed, whether it can be altered a bit to meet all parties' requirements is a question, or at least to get enough people to support it. Is this possible, or is it sort of just locked in concrete, as you indicated, would become operative? And it would only meet the requirements of Israel and the United States?
I think there's absolutely a desire. The president said as much, but and the reality is that there's absolutely a desire to have the two parties come together and negotiate. From the Trump perspective, there's plenty of flexibility in the plan. Now, of course, there's a limit beyond which the Israelis would be unwilling to go, but that's what's subject to negotiation. But I'm not holding my breath waiting for the negotiations to start, but if that were to happen, I think there would be plenty of flexibility from the U.S. side.
It's worth noting that the settler right is seething right now with Netanyahu. I mean, it's an interesting dimension of this. I don't think gets a lot of attention because he has, in accepting this, he has accepted the notion of a Palestinian state. He's accepted the notion of the land swaps. And if the Palestinians were to engage in the way that you're discussing, they could actually put Netanyahu in a very difficult position. I suspect that that Netanyahu's bet is that they won't do that, and so that he can get the benefits up front of the deal, meaning annexation of the Jordan Valley in particular, and the major settlement blocks, perhaps E1. I don't know how far he's going to go with that, without having to negotiate anything on the on the other side. But that option is there. Yes, sir. And we'll make this the last question. Make it a good one.
The best question for today.
Okay, I'm ready for it.
Dr. Alexander Ratnowski, retired president of the Rockefeller Institute. I know nothing about international diplomacy, so help me here.
That's not a good way to start the last question.
That's why I'm asking the question. If I knew the answer, I'd be there instead of here. But the plan has been presented and publicly rejected by the Palestinians. Now, I assume that's not the end of the process. So given your kind of inside look at things, what kind of negotiations, back channel or otherwise, are going on right now to move the plan along?
Well, it is important to look at the reactions of the Arab states, and there's sort of two things that you have to look at together rather than separately. So, upon the issuance of the plan, most of the leading Arab states reacted, I would say, lukewarmly, which is actually quite an achievement because under other circumstances they would have reacted as hostily as the Palestinians did. The fact that most of the Arab states reacted by not rejecting the plan, but by saying they didn't fully embrace it by any means, but said more or less it's a constructive plan. It's a good place, a starting place from which to negotiate. And then they had the last weekend they had the meeting of the Arab League where they collectively sort of rejected the plan. But you can't look at the rejection in isolation of the positive welcoming of the plan. You have to look at both of them together. And what that says is that the Arab leaders are in a tough spot. They're not able to fully embrace this plan while the Palestinians are so energetically opposed to it. But they're also not taking the Palestinian position, which is rejection. They're somewhere in between the two. And in between those two, the gap between where the Arab states are and where the Palestinians are is the question of whether over time, and that could be months or years, there will be a meeting of the minds where the Palestinian leadership recognizes that the Arab community, and to a lesser extent the rest of the world, principally the Europeans, persuade the Palestinians that it's in their interest to move forward in negotiations on this. Don't know if that's going to happen. It might well not, but that's the if someone is looking for reasons to be hopeful, that's what I would look at.
One of the myths of the peace process historically is that this issue is the key to regional security. And this issue is the key to U.S. cooperation with the wider Arab world. I don't think that has ever been true, but it's certainly since the Arab Spring of 2011, I think it has become obvious to the vast majority of observers that there's a lot going on in the region that has nothing to do with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And even if we were to solve it tomorrow, we were going to still have all of the problems in the region that we have. Solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not going to make the Iraq conflict, the Iraqi challenge, any easier to deal with. It's not going to make the Iranian threat in the region any less. It's not going to change the orientation of any major state in the region. We're basically going to have the same Middle East tomorrow that we have today, except we're going to have an agreement between the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis. So there's an argument out there now that in Washington, a number of prominent people who have been involved over the last 25 years in Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking have said this is a terrible plan because there was this growing cooperation between the Israelis and the Gulf, and between the U.S. and the Gulf about the Israeli-Palestinian question. And now, by being so supportive of the Israelis, the U.S. has ruined that, and that's the big strategic mistake here. I think that is a fanciful understanding of how the region works. I have no doubt that behind closed doors, the leaders in the Arab world don't like the American support for Israel. Israel is, newsflash, Israel's not popular in the Muslim world. Right? This is a fact of life. But the leaders in this region are realists. They understand that this has been, that the U.S.-Israeli relationship is a permanent fixture in the region. They have learned to deal with it for good or for ill in their minds. And this plan is not going to upset any of the major dynamics that were at work. They weren't at work because of this plan or the absence of this plan. They were at work for other reasons. And that's going to continue to be true. One of the things that's hanging out there right now behind the scenes is there's been a lot of discussion about a Bahraini-Israeli non-aggression pact. I think that, to me, that's the most interesting thing to watch. That may or may not come about. If it comes about, I think it'll be the first of several. We basically already have a de facto, a tacit U.S. Israeli UAE non-aggression pact. There's a lot of cooperation going on with the UAE. I expect to see how that continue. But I think if the Bahraini-Israeli non-aggression pact becomes public, we'll see other ones like it, and that'll be a very, very interesting. That'll be a very, very interesting direction. I think when you talk about secret diplomacy going on behind the scenes, that's the place to look. What the Palestinians are doing behind the scenes, I don't think is particularly. I doubt that there's much going on because their public position has been so emphatic. And if there is something going on, I doubt it's going to be very, very interesting. I think the real game is now elsewhere. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.